Let me make sure. Okay. About this thing about 30,000 people disappearing in Argentina, I used to have some discussions about that back when I was at Lockheed many years ago. I had a liberal friend and I was conservative. But anyway, that's another issue. All right. Here, I'll tell you what, here's the side that I took on that issue. That if those people were not suppressed, the communists would take over. And communism was a big issue at the time. And they were fighting communism. And that's why that some of these governments felt like they had to be repressive because the communists were there. All right, Brazil. Brazil is the one Latin American country where they speak Portuguese. But anyway, and if you look on a map, it's by far the biggest country in Latin America, the biggest Latin American country there is. Brazil has a problem with runaway inflation. They finally, in 1964, a military government took over and stayed in power for 20 years. They finally experienced an economic boom, largely with the help of aid from the United States, I must say. However, the wealth found its hands into a few people. Then inflation came along and destroyed the gains that people had made. Oh, you've not seen inflation much in your time, but when I was turning 30, Jimmy Carter was the president, and inflation was a huge problem. Inflation means that you can work hard to save your money, and then find your money is worthless by the time you need to spend it. Or you work hard to save to buy for a house, and by the time you've got enough money to buy the house, the price has gone up, and you can't afford one anyway. Inflation.
So everybody blamed it on Jimmy Carter.
Well, actually, I don't blame it all on Jimmy Carter. Part of it was due to the Arab-Israeli war, and part of it was due to Richard Nixon, who took us off the gold standard. As long as gold was anchored at $32 an ounce, that would have helped limit inflation. But and in the long run, maybe we're better off the gold standard. But in the short run, I think it hurt us. Now, it's not all Jimmy Carter's fault. Now, jumping ahead of the story on Brazil a little bit. These Latin American countries today in 2019 have a real problem. They're being taken over by gangs, young people. And even the politicians have to bribe the gangs to keep them quiet. And if you lived in a Latin American country, you'd have to pay about 20% of your income to gangs to keep them off your back.
Oh, that's true.
Something like 10 to 20%.
Someone like El Chapo, or like
Yeah, persons like that. Go ahead.
yeah, someone like El Chapo. He's had so much money that he just be paying the authorities. Like back in like Mexico.
Well, he just got a life sentence. If we're talking about the same person, he just got a life sentence. But these gangs would take over. Well, Brazil has elected a new president who's close friends to our president, and this president said, "We're going to get tough on criminals, and if a cop shoots a bad person, that cop will not be punished. That cop's going to be rewarded." And he said, "The criminals, I'm going to put them, if I have to, put them on a ship." And send the ship 3 or 4 miles out in the ocean where they can't come back, where there's no escape, and I'm going to leave them there. Oh yeah, he'll feed them and he'll clothe them. But he said, I'm going to leave them out there on the ship until they are either reformed. But he said all criminals, all gangs are going to be broken up. We'll see how well it works. But Brazil is still a democracy. It's had its problems for decades. And by the way, that president was elected on a campaign of promise of, I will clean up this nation. Again, we'll see. Now, moving from Brazil to Mexico. This book was written, before an influx of immigrants. But today, the big problem we have in Mexico is immigrant influx. But I'll leave that alone for now. Mexico is part of the free trade agreement with the United States. United States, Canada, Mexico, a free trade agreement. But Mexicans have a lot of discontent. I have heard now, just the last few days, that Mexico is about to take its country back. You might say, well, who's controlled Mexico? The gangsters, the gangs, the drug people. And Mexico is fighting hard, and their police are being trained in the United States on how to deal with these issues. We'll see if they actually can succeed. For Mexico to live so close to the United States, if you step across the Rio Grande in Mexico, it's almost like you're entering a different world. They are not, unlike Canada, they are not like the United States. Have a comment?
Well, yeah, I used to live in San Diego, and so we would go across the border, like, I mean, it was like literally like 20 minutes drive time
Yeah,
to go right over to Tijuana.
yeah.
And it is, yeah, it's different as night and day.
It's different, yeah. I went to Mexico one time.
And Juarez
And I
from
was so-
Texas, Juarez,
Yeah, I went
different
to,
as night and day.
from Brownsville, Texas to Matamoros,
Mhm.
Mexico, across the Rio Grande. The Rio Grande is not an impressive river, but the Mexicans allow their cattle to run loose, and you'd better not drive at night. Now, I don't know if that's still true or not, because their cattle are not fenced in.
Yeah.
I don't know if that's still true now, but it was then. I went there in 1976. All right. What is Western culture like? Now, again, we've been talking about the West. Well, the advances in technology have greatly changed the way of life. Western people are generally more educated than other people around the world. Most Westerners can afford washers, dryers, dishwashers, automobiles, and health care. Now, this book was written a few years back. Health care, that's a big issue. Permissiveness, oh yes. During the Victorian era, there was a whole lot of, sex was a hush-hush, we don't mention that topic. Then World War I saw a decline in morality. Pornography had its beginnings in the 1920s. Pornography and a little bit more sexual license. But after World War II, sexual promiscuity became even more noticeable. The traditional family broke up more and more. Then came the drug culture. I mean, I'm talking about the West now, whether it be France, Britain, the United States, or Latin America. And a new drug culture appeared on the scene. The drug consumption was linked with permissiveness. And in the late 1960s, young people my age rebelled. I was not part of the rebellion of the youth, by the way, but a lot of young people of my generation were. Women began to work more and more outside the home, and they were given the right to vote. Most of places in the West, women had the right to vote by 1920. They were expected to be both workers and homemakers. A lot of women rebelled. There came the women's liberation movement in the 1970s. I want to say this about Women's Lib, folk. One of the girls I went to college with and then taught school with, her classroom was right next to mine when I was teaching school. She embraced Women's Lib right about the time she started teaching next to me. She was 2 years behind me, 2 years younger than me. And she thought it was just great. Then Women's Lib took an unexpected turn. It started demanding that there not be separate restrooms for boys and girls. Boys and girls use the same restrooms. She didn't know if she wanted to continue it or not. But now I'm going to make a long story short. Today, this same woman, 68 years old, never been married. Her close friend, who also took up Women's Lib at the same time, also never married. I have not talked to her in more than 40 years. I don't know what she believes now. But I do know from talking around that she has never married. Probably retired by now. Now, here's where it says, your book says that it's estimated a woman with today's medicine must bear an average of 2.1 children per woman in order to keep the population steady. 2.1, and not one Western nation is doing that. Not one. In Italy, the birth rate is actually about one baby per woman, and that is not keeping the birth rate high.
You said not one
Not
nation?
one Western nation, not one, no.
Western.
Let me hasten to state, I said not one Western. Muslim women, sometimes some countries, Muslim women are averaging 8 babies per woman. So 2.1 just to keep the populations steady. And these days, the day of the big family is almost a thing of the past. But if you study genealogy, look at your chart, oftentimes couples would have 8, 10, 12, 14 children. Not much anymore. I know of one family where they have several, but not much anymore. Terrorism. All right, here's what I remember about terrorism. Communism once motivated terrorists. Today, the communists rarely engage in terror activities. A lot of the time, it's simply a desire for revolution. In other words, we want our government to change, so they will start bombing government offices, government buildings, or taking hostages. They're mostly motivated by his desire for revolution. Islam has engaged, and I don't hear as much about Islamic terrorism, but Islam has engaged in terrorism. And in 2001, Islamic terrorists invaded the United States and killed 3,000 people when they hit the World Trade Center, both towers, and hit the Pentagon. And again, the excuse they used did not surprise you. What I heard motivated Osama bin Laden was not that we were supporting Israel. We were once Osama bin Laden's friend. It was that we allowed Christian chaplains on holy Arabian soil. And see, here's why we had the chaplains, army chaplains. You don't send men into combat, most men, without letting them go through a religious ceremony first. It's known that men fight better after they've gone through a religious service than they would before, than they would have otherwise. And when the commanding officer indicates or hints that we're about to go into combat, all of a sudden the chaplain becomes the most important man on the team. So anyway, we had some chaplains, Christian chaplains on Arabian soil, and this upset Osama bin Laden, so he turned against us for that reason. Even though we were there in Arabia to defend Arabia against Saddam Hussein. But Osama bin Laden did not see it that way, so he masterminded the invasion. Eventually, Osama bin Laden was hunted down and killed, and I say that tongue-in-cheek because the evidence, well, we don't hear from him anymore, so maybe he was. All right. Because Western nations are having so few babies, a lot of them have called in foreigners to make up for the deficit, particularly Islamic foreigners. This is not as true in the United States as it is in Europe, but these Islamic foreigners will come in, and once there's no need for them, they won't leave. They come in and stay. Oftentimes they bring their families with them, and then the immigrant population increases. Pollution, a big problem, but there have been efforts to curb it. Folk, you can't appreciate. Today's automobiles are so much cleaner than they were in the 1950s. In the 1950s, you could smell the exhaust fumes, and if you were to walk down to downtown Atlanta in 1960, it was a smelly place to be because of exhaust from buses and trucks and fumes. Today, you can walk down the streets of Atlanta and not breathe car fumes because the government stepped in and made cars burn much, much, much cleaner. All right. Now, these are movements known as the green movements. All right.
What's the green movement about the pollution?
Pollution, yeah.
Okay.
The green, in other words, to try to keep the country green, keep the world green. Now, when I was 9 years old, our teacher asked us, well, the lesson was a history lesson, it was on inventors. And we talked about Samuel Morse, Thomas Edison, the Wright brothers, George Washington Carver, these are great inventors who helped America. She asked us, are there inventions being made today? Well, I couldn't think of one. I mean, I was only 9 years old. My classmates said, well, we have brighter colored shirts and we have better cars and all this stuff. But what invention has been made since then, the one invention that has really changed us the most, has been the microchip. Microprocessors. Microprocessors are now used in a lot of automobiles. The microchip led to the invention of the home computer. This little device here has 100 times more computing power than what we had during the Apollo days when our astronauts would go to the moon. The internet, well, the computer may prove to be the most revolutionary device we've ever invented. The internet is a link-up of computers around the world. Hopefully all of you are aware of that. The internet. Religions seem to be dying out for a while, but it has revived somewhat. Even Roman Catholicism in Europe, which was dying, has revived. One thing that helped, right when the Catholic Church needed it, they elected a really good man to be Pope, Pope John the 23rd. He was a reform pope. He instituted a number of reforms that made Catholic practices more liberal. Today, the present pope is Pope Francis. Yeah, I do have a name. Pope Francis is the present pope. Pope John Paul II reigned for long. Pope John the 23rd only reigned for 4 years. John Paul II was pope for some 16 years. So it's actually more like 22 years.
You said Pope John the 23rd, he reigned for how long?
About 4 years, that's all.
And
But he was right, yeah, he was a reformer.
Sure.
He came right when he was needed, and he called an ecumenical council, and they decided to make some changes that were long overdue.
And then you said the other pope, who's the next pope?
The Pope John Paul II, he was the first non-Italian in 400 years. But he was a Polish pope. A lot of Catholics would like to credit him with bringing down communism, just like a lot of Americans like to blame Reagan. I personally think communism fell from within. Television has been a big source of entertainment now. Folk, this book was written a few years ago, and my notes were taken about 10 years ago. I personally believe that the watching of television has declined in the last few years, owing in large part to the kids are playing computer games or playing TV games. But if any of you have any thoughts on that, your input is welcome. But television used to be the #1 thing that young kids would do when they had their free time, is watch TV. It was a big source of entertainment. Sports still occupy a whole lot of our time. All right. The Olympic Games held every 4 years. We invite teams from all over the world to participate. Okay. End of chapter